Hello readers, I'm the Avid Reader and today we're reviewing The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization, written by Peter Zeihan in 2022. So this is Peter Zeihan's most recent book and his fourth book in his series on global geopolitics. And it's written in the same spirit as his previous three books. So deglobalization, the United States withdraws from the world order, things are disrupting, and you're gonna have a lot of problems in the Eastern Hemisphere where things will be pretty much fine in the Western Hemisphere. So the first section is called The End of an Era. Here Peter Zeihan claims we're gonna deglobalize and that the American-backed order is gonna end now and that you're gonna have global disruptions in the 2020s and 2030s because the United States is no longer there with their navy to protect trade and security. And by the way, there's one little kind of prediction towards the end of this section which basically says, oh, don't be surprised if Xi Jinping loses power in his 2022 bid for re-election as head of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, Peter Zeihan was wrong in this prediction. Xi has consolidated power even further now, in reality. And one problem with Peter Zeihan here is that he misunderstands what Bretton Woods is. Bretton Woods ended in 1971 when the United States left the so-called gold standard. Bretton Woods has not been alive for the past 50 years. And this globalization that Peter Zeihan talks about, he seems to think it didn't occur before the end of World War II. But that's not true. You've had several waves of globalization, as you know if you're a history student. For example, during the era of Pax Britannica, from 1815 to 1914, especially during the 1850s and 1860s, you had a lot of free trade, at least in Europe. So when he talks about these imperial systems that are closed from each other, that was true in certain periods of history, but it was not true continuously. The trading system closed up in the two world wars and the period in between, but it was relatively open before World War I. But Peter Zeihan does not seem to realize this. He thinks that all of these things exist because of the United States, which is kind of an act of hubris. Now let's move on to section 2, which is transport. And Peter Zeihan talks about the technology of containerization, how that has reduced transport costs a lot, and also that the US Navy guarantees trade, which means you can import stuff and export stuff without being afraid that it will be stolen by pirates or other governments. And Peter Zeihan believes that this will end once the US withdraws from the system, or as it is withdrawing. So he says that basically pirates will start stealing shipments and some states will go rogue and have privateers or themselves seize shipments, such as India and Turkey, which no, the American Navy is not going to stop their security guarantee. And Peter Zeihan fails to realize this. All of these different aspects that he looks at, if the USA withdraws from it, it's gonna hurt the American economy very bad. It's gonna throw it into a recession, maybe even a depression, because that's how interconnectedness works. And he believes that without the US backing, the supply chains will unravel, and he predicts depopulation and deurbanization, which deurbanization, that could kind of happen because people may want to move to suburbs, but not in the way he means. But depopulation, that's a thing that's gonna happen gradually. He thinks it's gonna happen because of famines. No, it's just gonna happen because people have less kids. Next, section 3 is about finance. And here he says that basically the large amount of economic growth that you've had since the 90s has been because boomers are old workers in their 50s who have a lot of capital, which allows them to invest and lend it out as credit throughout the world. And he talks about how credit has allowed a bunch of countries to develop a lot, but he doesn't think this will last, with the exception of the USA, because the USA has inequality, which means it has a lot of rich people who are going to go into retirement, which means they will have money aside to still invest in the American economy, while in other countries you don't have that large class of rich people who are getting old, and those old people instead will withdraw their money and use it themselves. But Peter Zeihan makes some mistakes in this book. He somehow mixes up inflation and deflation. He thinks that both can really occur at the same time, and then his definition of disinflation is just wrong. Disinflation is just an inflation rate, but it's a reduced inflation rate compared to the previous year. And deflation is a decrease in prices. Peter Zeihan distinguishes between disinflation and deflation, as disinflation is a good decrease in prices, deflation is a bad decrease in prices. That's not what I learned in economics in high school. So he misunderstands economics, although even though he claims to understand them. And he predicts that there will be a bunch of capital flight and capital control, which I would say you're gonna have capital flight where countries don't have a good business environment. If you have a good business environment, you're not gonna have capital flight because you're gonna make money there. And Zeihan does something weird in this section. He lumps all the Asian financial models under the same category, but that's not true, because some of the Asian financial models were much more state-driven than others. On one end, you have Singapore, where the government barely intervened in the economy for the most part, with the Singaporean economy being able to grow because of laissez-faire economics. On the other side, you have China, where a market economy has been allowed to develop to some extent, but still in large part the Chinese economy is driven by the Chinese government. And by the way, when the Chinese Communist Party owns or indirectly owns a bunch of Chinese businesses, that's not private. Government credit is not private. And in this book, he defines capitalism, socialism, and communism in really weird ways. He calls America capitalist, he calls Europe socialist. Which no, they're both mixed market economies. The United States might be more capitalist than Europe for the most part, while there are several European countries that are more capitalist than the United States. Switzerland and Ireland are a couple of those countries, for example. The US government spending a bunch of money and the central bank making money cheap, that's not capitalist. Peter Zeihan uses definitions in a loose way that aren't correct. Next, we move on to energy, and here he talks a bit about green energy. And here Zeihan states that green energy will only be viable in a small amount of places around the world, so solar and wind energy. And with decreased trade, you will have less fossil fuels traded, but you still need energy for your economy because you don't want to die and decivilize. So this would lead countries to switch to coal, so while their living standards are decreasing, pollution is still increasing. So that's kind of ironic. And Zeihan totally ignores nuclear because he says it's not politically plausible. That's not really an argument. Nuclear is the best bet to reducing climate change. And he argues that there will be a bunch of places that will decivilize, which, come on, no. You won't have a bunch of countries that will decivilize. Do you know the last time that occurred? It wasn't recently. You have changes in governments, but you've not had entire civilizations die down recently at all. Next section is industrial materials, and here Zeihan states that with deglobalization it will make it harder to import the raw materials that you need, which means that the United States and a handful of countries will be fine. They will find ways to get the raw materials they need, often because they have a lot of them at home, or they can get the raw materials in places that are friendly to them, or through neo-colonialism. But other countries, and especially China, are in trouble according to Zeihan. Then Zeihan talks about manufacturing, and here what we don't necessarily realize is that supply chains are huge. So let's just take this watch hypothetically, for example. The parts to make this watch and where it was assembled and where it was manufactured, there are often dozens of steps to this we don't realize, and if you have a small disruption you can have big problems. And he argues that North America will be relatively fine as the United States and Mexico are integrating more and more their supply chains. And the renegotiations of NAFTA by Trump both benefited Mexico and the United States, so-called, because it encourages manufacturing in NAFTA countries, not only in the United States but also in Mexico. And Zeihan claims that the countries that have not yet industrialized, the opportunity for that is gone now, and they will never industrialize themselves, and instead they will devolve back to where they were 200 years ago or worse. The only countries that are not developing are those countries that choose not to develop. Those are countries like Cuba or North Korea who have closed themselves off from the world. Countries that are ready to be friendly towards the United States and the world economy, those countries will be able to develop eventually, as long as you have the political institutions and the openness that facilitate this. Zeihan also claims that China will experience a technological slowdown, which sure, that's plausible, just to what extent? I mean, Zeihan believes that China will basically crash, but in my opinion, they will slow down, but they won't crash. And the final section that Peter Zeihan talks about is agriculture. Here he says that we're gonna return to growing wheat as the staple food, as wheat is the easiest food product to grow. Most agricultural products can only be grown in a few places. Wheat can be grown pretty much anywhere, so this means that with deglobalization and less imports, you won't grow the food that you exported previously because you can no longer import other food. You will instead focus on growing wheat within your country. But without fertilizers, Peter Zeihan believes that a bunch of countries are kind of screwed, and he believes that there will be a wide-scale famine in the coming years that will kill 1 billion people and have 2 million people in malnutrition. We have relative free trade, and we have things like the UN to mitigate famines. The only large-scale famines we could have are because of war, such as, for example, if Russia erupted to civil war, then you could see Russia having a famine maybe, or governments pursuing just dumb economic policies, like Venezuela, where you're kind of having a famine there right now. And Zeihan says that climate change will benefit a minority of agricultural regions, but will make it impossible to grow food in a lot of places, which could be true, depending on how severe climate change is. And that's an overview of Peter Zeihan's The End of the World is Just the Beginning. So now time for the evaluation. So how would I rate this book? I'm gonna give it a 4 out of 10. Now, Peter Zeihan talked about how COVID showed really how much deglobalization we're gonna have. And sure, we deglobalized a little because of COVID, but globalization is not in complete recession. It is regressing in some aspects, but going forward in some other aspects. It depends on what you look at. So sure, you may have some deglobalization, in my opinion, but not the large-scale one that Peter Zeihan predicts. And another con with this book is that the conclusions of this book are basically the same as his previous 3 books. And if you think about it, sure, the content might be different, but in the end, Peter Zeihan always comes to the same conclusion. The United States and the Western Hemisphere are gonna be pretty much fine, and most of the Eastern Hemisphere is screwed. And this is predetermined because of geography, demographics, and energy. Now, if you understand history, nothing is predetermined. You have advantages and disadvantages, but how you use them is how you will succeed. There are a bunch of countries that have horrible geographies. They still manage to succeed. There are a bunch of countries that have good geographies. They still screwed up. I mean, just look at Argentina. They have a good geography. They're not the most successful economy in Latin America. The most successful economy is Chile. They don't have as many resources. They don't have as good as a geography as Argentina, yet they're still succeeding better. Why? Because they have better economic policies. I disagree with Zeihan with his determinism. In my opinion, what drives things are power and economics and culture, but those things are all very dynamic, so nothing is predetermined in one direction. There are general laws in human sciences, but whether you choose to follow those human laws or not determines whether you will succeed or not. That's my vision of the world. And I don't believe that the United States will withdraw from the system. And Peter Zeihan does make a bunch of generalizations that are just wrong. Like he says, the United States in the past previous 8 presidents have been screwing up the potential to save the global system, which, no. Bush Sr. and Clinton are 2 presidents that strongly supported the rules-based system. And as did Obama to a certain extent. And as does Biden right now, to a large extent. That's what NATO and the EU is. And he believes that China will collapse, but Stratford has been predicting that China will collapse for the past 15 years, 20 years, and it never happens. China's economy hasn't slowed down that much, and they haven't had a recession really yet, as Stratford and Zeihan has predicted. One thing with this book is that you could call it historicist speculative fiction, because there aren't really any sources provided in this book. This book has some sources for the graphs that are included, but for the arguments that Peter Zeihan makes, he just looks back at history, which is often misrepresented without any footnotes, or the footnotes that he has are flippant, not any sources based on any historical material, so his arguments aren't cogent. So what he predicts here, you could look at it in a sense as speculative fiction. And I read a bunch of history and geopolitics, and I see that Peter Zeihan makes repeatedly several factual errors, such as screwing up the population numbers for some countries, or claiming that China has the worst demographics. They do not. There are some European countries that have worse demographics than China, and South Korea's birth rate is worse than China. And why do I believe that China is not screwed? They have a strong culture. They are basically a homogeneous nation that is united, and unlike Russia, they do have political and economic institutions that have the potential to further develop more and more. So, should you read Peter Zeihan's The End of the World is Just the Beginning? It depends. Peter Zeihan has written 4 books. They all kind of say the same thing, just said in different words. So, in my opinion, once you've read one Peter Zeihan book, that's enough. They're interesting, they're kind of funny, but it's unnecessary to buy all of his 4 books, which aren't that cheap, by the way. If you want to get them all, it's gonna cost you about 100 euros or so, probably, at least. In my opinion, you should pick one of the 4 books, read it, but with a huge grain of salt. Maybe The End of the World is Just the Beginning would be the best book as it's the most recent. But is this good geopolitics? No. Stratford's predictions of war and famine and disaster, they're not founded on any basis of reality. They're founded on misunderstandings of history and economics and geography. You may want me to go more in depth about my thoughts about Peter Zeihan, and I'm gonna do so in a future video where I'm gonna evaluate Peter Zeihan and all the 4 books I've read. So stay tuned for that in a few weeks. And if you enjoyed this book review, then you should check out my book review of The Next 100 Years by George Friedman, which is another book that makes bogus geopolitical predictions for the most part. Anyways, I'm the avid reader, and I will see you readers next time.